Yeah, well, first of all, thank you. Thanks, Juban. Thanks, People Doc. And thanks all of you for coming. I'm super excited to be back in Paris.
Closer to the mic.
Closer to the mic, yeah. So, yeah, super excited to be back in Paris and meet all of you. So, I'm sure it's going to be an interesting chat, and I'm looking forward to your questions. So, back to me, I work at Stripe. I lead developer relations. I am based in San Francisco. And so, as part of my role, I spend a lot of time with our product and engineering teams trying to really build the best developer tools we can, like elegant APIs, very simple developer platforms for founders, builders, when they start and grow their companies. And as a result, I also spend a ton of time outside of Stripe, meeting people like you, developers, founders, and trying to really understand the challenges they have every day and how we can make the Stripe platform better for them to grow and scale more quickly. So that's kind of what I do. Previously, I used to work at Twitter. I was working on the Twitter API, the platform, and the Fabric SDK. That's now part of Firebase at Google, if some of you know Firebase. And before that, maybe some of you remember, I was the co-founder and CTO of JollyCloud. So I was building a web-based operating system here in Paris. So we're targeting like consumer netbooks and trying to bet on the cloud and the web for building an OS. So,
Cool, thanks. Can you help us understand? I know you don't like that question, but just to get started, give us a few key figures of Stripe, so just we can realize what's the scale of Stripe, because that will be a focus for tonight. So
sure,
yeah. Just so let's realize what it means.
Yeah, so Stripe, for those of you who don't really know Stripe yet, we're building the commerce infrastructure of the internet. So what that means is that we're trying to build all the tools and all that infrastructure that developers need when they want to accept payments online. And so we're now live in 25 countries. The Stripe API handles more than 100 million API requests a day, to give you an idea of scale. What else can I say? We're now 1,100 people worldwide in 9 offices. And yeah, I think what's very fascinating to work in that space at the scale of Stripe now, we have like millions of businesses relying on Stripe, which means that when a card, for instance, arrives on the Stripe network, there's an 89% chance we've seen that card before. So that can give you an idea of the scale of Stripe and the transactions that we're now handling every day.
Cool. Thanks. Why did you fall in love with API? Like you could have chosen to go to regular products or a more UI-based product, but why APIs?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, when I was working on JollyCloud, I was already kind of tinkering a lot with APIs because the goal for me was to build this OS for the cloud and kind of gather all your services in one place. And for that, like APIs are kind of the vehicle of that data and all of that actionable, products you can build. But I think what's also interesting about API is that if you rewind, let's say 15 years, it was extremely expensive to build a startup. It was like roughly $5 million to build a startup 15 years ago. And it was also extremely slow to go global. And since then, we had the chance to have like kind of a few phenomenons to help us along the way. One was the rise of open source and the cloud. So now, like as of like 10 years ago, you no longer really build your own data centers. You can rely on Google Cloud or AWS to kind of get started more quickly. And same goes for open source. Now you can use like Mongo or MySQL, like open source projects without investing a lot of money in like licenses. But more recently, what I find even more interesting is the rise of APIs, because that's to me changing fundamentally the way we build software and companies. Because previously, for instance, if you were building a product that had any kind of search or any kind of like communication component, you would have to build all of this yourself. But now the beauty is using the APIs, you can rely on Algolia, you can rely on Twilio, you can rely on SendGrid. And what that means is that as a developer, you can really focus on just what makes your product unique. You don't have to spend a ton of time reinventing the wheel. So I think that's what makes the APIs very fascinating to me. And same in the case of Stripe and commerce.
Cool. Who's building API here? Like on a daily basis, working on crafting an API?
Oh, that's awesome. Quite a few.
Yeah, that's cool. I guess if you come to that meetup, that's something we share, at least in common. Do you know what's API? It's not IPA reversed. Huh? It's not the name of a beer or something.
But I think most people consume APIs, but a smaller fraction
Yeah.
actually build and expose APIs because that's harder.
And that's a great transition. It was not scripted at all, but that's the first theme we start with. It's the developer experience, because when I think about Stripe, I think the first thing that comes to my mind is developer experience. So my experience with API is more building the experience around, and Stripe has been a great inspiration in the past. And so when I contacted Romain, that was the first thing I wanted to chat with him. And so I think Stripe has managed to set some standards, or at least rise the bar of what's an API product, and not just like a piece of software that help machine communicate together. And so there are quite a few things that done well, from documentation, SDK, consistency in the product. So you don't need to learn a new API every time Stripe releases product. How many products you have in your portfolio now?
I mean, it depends how you slice them and which countries you look at, but we have like roughly 6, 7 major products.
Yeah, and as you were explaining me before, it's different teams which are mostly autonomous.
Yeah, but if you look at that from the API lens, there's like hundreds of API endpoints now on the overall like Stripe API.
Cool. So it starts to be also a challenge for a provider like that to make sure that when you use the API globally across the different products, it's not a nightmare to maintain, it's not a nightmare to learn, etc. So that's the first theme we're going to go through. Um, let's so yeah, maybe let's get started by really defining first what's an API in your context, like the API of Stripe. What does it mean for? Is it used internally, on the outside, etc.?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because I think Stripe is a bit unique in that sense. Like when you think about APIs in general, most companies will build one or several products, and ultimately they will want to create an ecosystem, and they will probably want to expose some of those functionalities using an API. And in the case of Stripe, what's interesting is that the platform for developers and the API is kind of the main vehicle for the features we're trying to deliver. And so we have this very developer-centric approach from day one. I think we always start thinking APIs and developer tools first, and then ultimately we're trying to also build kind of UIs and tooling for other kinds of audiences at some companies, not only developers, but first and foremost, we always think about like developers. So in that sense, we're a bit unique because the platform is really key, and it's kind of the main thing that everybody at Stripe really thinks about. Like everybody at Stripe lives and breathes developers every day.
So when you start a new feature, I guess you start by crafting the endpoint, like what the experience should look like, how should I name that endpoint, like
Yeah, because when you think about like let's say you're building a SaaS business or maybe you're building a marketplace, ultimately people will have like very concrete needs and challenges, and the way we'll deliver that product to them will be with an API and also kind of the client libraries they can use with their favorite languages. But we want to make sure that experience really like is simple and very delightful for them. Because the way we think about developer experience or even like developers in general is by really saying that developers are the highest leverage within companies. Like we think that developers are the obviously a scarce resource, but they're also the most important resource within any technology company. And so that's why we care so much about developer experience. And I don't think there's like one answer that says, oh yeah, this is a great developer experience, this is a bad one. It's like kind of a constellation of details that all matter discretely. So of course you want to have like a consistent API, so that's why we spend a ton of time on that. But you also want to make sure that like the onboarding is simple and documentation and so on, like at every point of the journey.
And especially when you mix an API with regulation, with something as complex as payment, it's not only about the quality of your software or the quality of your product, it's also dealing with the different regulation, etc. So it's a double challenge.
Yeah, I think even beyond regulation, it's even just like the state of payment being very different in many countries. If you rewind exactly 10 years, I don't know if some of you remember and tried to even like accept payment online as a developer, it was not impossible, but it was extremely complex. Like all you had to do was going through all those hoops of like signing up and creating a merchant account, and you have to like fill in those forms, and you
looks like the companies you were talking to had just heard of the internet. You had to fax some documents, and maybe in a few weeks' time you would have an account for a thing. And even then, with all those hoops, you could not really create like the customer experience that you wanted. You had to limit yourself. And so building a product was hard enough, but getting paid for it was even harder. And so if you look at the state of payments today, like you mentioned, regulation, that's obviously like a big thing. But beyond that, I think the nature of the Stripe product is different in every country. If you look, for instance, in Asia, obviously people use a ton like WeChat Pay and Alipay. Well, like in the US, obviously you have those like card-based method, but things like Google Pay and Apple Pay that really people enjoy when they purchase things on their phone. And you don't have to go as far because Europe is a pretty exotic place for payments already. I don't know if some of you knew, but like 55% of the transactions online do not use cards. So like there's a ton of payment methods out there, and a lot of little things to think about when you want to launch like Stripe in a new country.
Cool. Do you have any questions so far, guys? Cool. No? Okay, let's dive deeper then.
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's do it. I think if we talk about the developer experience, like, could you help us describe like what's the cycle of a feature at Stripe? Like, let's say, I don't know, a new payment method or a new regulation, or you need to support a new feature. What's the cycle of things you will have to define before considering you can release that new endpoint or that new set of endpoint reliably without hurting the experience?
Yeah, that's a good question, because there's not like always the exact same answer for everything. But I think the common factor for pretty much everything we build comes from users, whether they're like existing users that would want to have like extra functionality, or maybe some existing users who want to enter a new market and expand to new countries, or potential prospects that are also kind of looking to join, like to move to Stripe, or maybe looking to build something new on Stripe but have some specific needs. So I think the common factor for pretty much everything we do is kind of users first, and trying to prioritize that for everything we do. As an example, I don't know if some of you know we have a product called Connect, which essentially is the product that people build when they want to build like a marketplace or a platform. Things like Drivey or Deliveroo, for instance, are using Stripe Connect. And in the very early days of Stripe, before Connect existed, people were already trying to build kind of a marketplace, but they had some very weird and strange like requests for us. They were like, hey, like in my Stripe account, could I potentially have like thousands of bank accounts in there? We're like, wait, what are you trying to do? And like, oh, of course, you're trying to build a marketplace. That makes sense. And so like kind of talking to users a ton and kind of defining their needs. And sometimes people want a faster horse, but in fact, you have to build the car for them. So like really spending time digging into the problems and how we can solve them. And then like, of course, when we have that in place, for instance, we relaunched this year the billing stack. Again, like a ton of customer requests had to go in there. With like, the SaaS businesses are getting more and more advanced now. Like people want to not only have like some plans, but they want to have like, prices per seats with like extra features. And maybe if you have like a CDN service, maybe when you want to charge extra like cents per gigabyte, like all of those things. And so, yeah, users first, and then kind of defining what the API should look like. And we spend a ton of time on like API design and API review. So every time we want to introduce a change in the API, usually we write up a proposal, whether it's a new endpoint or maybe just like a small change, like renaming a parameter. And we spend a ton of time like with a few experts on the API, just like reviewing those changes and making sure we can guarantee that the experience overall for Stripe is still very good.
And how do you define a good experience? What are the key factors you're taking in account?
I think just like putting yourself in the shoes of the developers first. Like I remember, for instance, when we were first working on Apple Pay for the web, I spent a lot of time with one of our engineers who was working on this project and trying to even define what is the minimal, most elegant JavaScript code we could make developers write. And is there anything else we can remove from it? And can we drill it down to like maybe 3 or 4 lines that are absolutely critical? and easy to integrate. And if that's the thing we're happy with, then let's make it real and let's do whatever has to be done instead of like thinking about like our easier path to get something done, putting ourselves in the shoes of people integrating. And that's also why we dog food a lot. So one thing one term I like to use, and I think Google has used it before also for their developer relations team. uh, I see myself and the people I work with are kind of like the customer zero of the APIs we build. It's like, let's try to build something with it, and if we have any point of friction along the way, that's something we need to fix because developers are obviously going to run into it.
Cool. So when you say you, it's the DevRel team, right?
Yeah, mostly DevRel team, but also most of the engineers at Stripe spend time, dogfooding and building using our APIs.
How long could that cycle last?
Really depends. Sometimes like some features are pretty easy to ship and pretty fast. Sometimes it's like a major, suite of functionality that takes longer. So it's really hard to give a number. It can go from weeks to months.
What's interesting in what you said is that you already defined that the experience of the API expand beyond the the web application, right? You mentioned the libraries, which is also a challenge in itself because now I don't know how many languages you support.
I think 7 on the backend side, and then if you include obviously mobile, you have iOS and Android on top of that. So yeah, kind of 10, I would say.
Yeah, so that challenge you mentioned, like that piece of JavaScript, you would have to multiply the same debate, the same discussion 10 times.
Well, not always. I think that's mostly at the API design level. I think JavaScript, the example I was referring to for Apple Pay on the web was a bit special because Apple Pay on the web meaning like in the browser. So that's the JavaScript library just for that, Stripe.js. But I think most of the API discussions are at the API level, and we try to keep the client libraries very consistent. But yeah, I think it's mostly on the API design that the discussion takes place.
Cool. And okay, so it's not so much of a challenge for you today to maintain those libraries, to keep them idiomatic. So the experience you have is great from the documentation, which I think is another big subject, and where you are doing a really great job, to the libraries, to the API design.
I mean, there's clearly a lot, and we're trying to maintain those really actively. And what we want is when we ship something new for Stripe, we also want to make sure we have like client library support. So otherwise, it would be kind of a deceptive experience to be like, oh, something is now just released, and like, let me get my Node.js binding or something. I was like, oh, it's not in there. So trying to make sure everything aligns perfectly. But we are today maintaining those libraries by hand because we are also adding a lot of like, small things under the hood. So developers have like an easier time. For instance, like auto retries if the network is down for a few seconds or something. So we do those things in the bindings, but we're also spending some time exploring new things around like Open API and can we, auto-generate some of the things, including the test suites, for instance. Test suites are a great place to experiment with, Open API.
Have you observed any trend, like any platform or any language that's rising a lot these years, or community which are really attracted by Stripe?
Yeah, I think we keep tabs on those things, and in fact, it's one of the ways also we expand the list of languages we support. So, for instance, I think roughly like 4 years ago, the original like Stripe Node library was actually not written by us, but it was written by one of the community members, and it really took off when Node started to really be like the de facto choice for a lot of the new startups. And so we worked with that community person to like transition it over to Stripe. And the same thing happened a year ago. One of the major languages that Stripe did not officially support was actually C# and .NET. And there was a lot of demand for Stripe to offer something great there. And so once again, we worked with the original author of that library to make sure we can actually transition that over to Stripe and make sure that existing users would benefit from new features without having to rewrite anything. So these were two examples where like we worked with the community to actually embrace things that users requested.
Among the people who are working on the API here, who face that challenge of publishing, maintaining, writing great libraries? Cool. Yeah, I think it's a, yeah.
mic's coming.
Thanks. So the way you describe Stripe and the way you want to maximize developer happiness, it sounds a lot like Apple with striving for simplicity and everything. So I don't know if that's like one of your inspiration at Stripe, but it's what it reminds me of. And a mantra for developing API that I love that I earned at Apple, which is the philosophy there is a good API that makes simple things simple and that makes complex things possible, which is, I think, a great way of thinking of APIs.
Yeah, I agree. And on your first point, I think, yeah, the reason we spend so much time, obsessing about details of the developer experience is because we really think that it has an impact on how people like perceive the API and how fast they can get their products to market. I was just telling Arno earlier, there's like this like study that we're actually publishing at Stripe today. We've spoken to like thousands of companies worldwide, trying to understand like how they hire and use developers and engineers within their companies. And we found some pretty remarkable things in there. But one of the things we found was that on average, developers spend 17 hours every week working on like maintaining legacy code or debugging, doing some plumbing. Like 17 hours a week is a ton of time. And if you combine all of these things, and like specifically they said 4 hours a week on bad code. And so when you think about all that time that developers spend on like unnecessary things or suboptimal things, like overall that's like a huge opportunity cost, and that opportunity cost is like is something huge that we want to have an impact on, and so that's why we care so much about developer experience. And I think just that time, like badly spent, is like $85 billion worldwide when you think about like growing the GDP. And so we think that if developers were actually spending their time, very effectively, that's the potential of like raising the GDP by 3 trillion over 10 years. And so, like we're talking about APIs and developer experience, but those things, if you really empower developers to use their time as best as they can, that can have like a huge impact. And so I think, designing very powerful but also simple APIs really matters.
Do you guys feel impacted by that? Like, does it remind something? Is it on your study,
or
you
spend time every week on like bad code and like debugging things or plumbing, and you wish you would use an API instead?
I don't know. Let's do a roundup of how many. Yeah, I've seen your questions. Like, how many hours per week you spend on the bad code or maintaining legacy? Let's say 3 hours at least. At least 3 hours. Okay.
Yeah, that sounds like above that.
Yeah. 10 hours per week. 15 hours. Benoit, what do you think? 10 hours. Okay. Maybe we're working with more modern tools, or we have less legacy code to maintain in that crowd tonight.
Yeah, and I'm sure that's also why when you have like the tech startup world, I think that it's a space that's more agile, and like developers have a seat at the decision making table for like choosing tools and so on. More traditional companies, not so much. But increasingly, that's changing.
But I'm sure, like, I speak with Benoit because I know him well, but I'm sure 10 hours of Benoit focusing on a security topic at screen would be more efficiently used when working on bad code. So I agree, there's room for improvement here. Cedric, what's your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, how do you deal with versioning APIs, and when do you think this is time to deprecate an API or an endpoint, basically, or how many versions of the API of Stripe do you have internally?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I've enjoyed the most about Stripe, even before working at Stripe as purely a user of the Stripe API. I think that's one thing that I wished more and more companies would embrace, but it's this idea of like backwards compatibility. So to answer the first part of your question, the way we version the API, so we think at Stripe, we think as every change that can be a breaking change, we're actually more than happy to make it, because we have this idea that every time you want to make such a breaking change, we're going to cut a new API version. So it's not going to be V1, V3, V20. It's going to simply be like the date of today. And that only applies to breaking changes, because if you want just to make an additive, update to the API, that's totally fine for existing users. But so when we think about payments, it's really the lifeblood of your business. So imagine if we are breaking someone's integration, they're going to lose money. So that's very critical not to do. Um, and so when we introduce those new API versions, and we're really happy to make them, uh, what we do is essentially we have this concept of gates where we put a layer of transformation for every request coming in and every response coming out. So essentially, the main code base of Stripe is always up to date with the latest and brightest API. We have layers of transformations of requests coming in, responses going out, and then when someone writes code for Stripe today, we log their API version at the version of today. And if they want to proactively upgrade themselves in 6 months from now, then they can just click a button, review the changes that might impact them, and decide to go ahead or not. But that means that if you're writing code with the Stripe API today, we might make some changes in next year, but in a year from now, your code will still work. And on the second part of your question, I think that's one of the things we're starting to discuss more and more is like, how long do you keep that? Is it forever? Is it just like a few years? I don't think we have a precise answer yet. Um, but now that the Stripe API has been like publicly available for like 6, 7 years, I think those questions are starting to be thought about a bit more. But yeah, I wish like more API companies would copy that part of Stripe. It's pretty hard to build, but when you have it, it makes it much easier to even correct mistakes, because no API is always perfect. You're gonna make some mistakes, but if you can actually adjust along the way, that's pretty convenient.
So far, you haven't sunset any iteration of the API.
There's been a few exceptions to that. Like security has been one of the exceptions. For instance, like if you were relying on old versions of TLS, like TLS 1.0, TLS 1.1, like at some point we had to break you because of PCI compliance and so on. So security is probably one of the major exceptions to that rule. But when we are in control of the code, usually we try not to break users, or at least we give them a ton of time and help them move on to the new versions, because sometimes they can also benefit from new versions that might be more efficient and so on. So we also want to bring users with us along the way.
So you think you've succeeded to convince people to reinvest time in Stripe, to spend time in their code and actually change to adapt to the new versions?
Yeah, but I think what's interesting about using an API is that usually the touch points are fairly small. Like even if you're building something very complex, like a SaaS business, we're trying to take on most of the business logic for you so that your integration still feels fairly simple. But yeah, the backwards compatibility thing is a big deal, especially when you want to work on your integration and not worry that it might break next week. I remember when I was working at Twitter, we didn't have such thing for the versioning of the API, and that left a few inconsistencies that should really never have made it to production. There was one that was probably my favorite one, and it's my favorite one because it's about the Twitter favorites. And I remember an engineer having the British spelling of favorite in the API, and that made it to production. And all of a sudden, developers are starting to use favorite with a U at this point just to get the favorite count. But everywhere else, it's a favorite with just O. And then you have you have now 2 spellings of favorite in all of your code base. And once you have that mistake, no backwards compatibility, well, we're going to have to live with it forever. So that's a bit unfortunate.
It reminds me something at Merget with the French spelling.
Oh, you had one of these?
Yes, I have just a question about something we are in care is about GDPR.
Yep.
Did GDPR take a lot of time to implement in Stripe because you manage process payment and it's very sensitive data.
Yep.
And for maybe not API development, but for very after the API, after the call, it was I believe a big project.
Yeah, it was. I don't have like an exact number in mind or something, but I know that many teams at Stripe have been impacted. as in like just doing whatever was necessary ahead of time just to make sure everything was ready for GDPR, whether it was like getting more like, automation in place for people requesting some of their data, or maybe like, protecting some of the data in certain ways and so on. So many teams have been working on that to meet the deadline. I remember the team I worked the most closely to, the developer platform team, had to do some migrations as well to make sure everything would be like locked and compatible with everything GDPR. But yeah, I guess like when you have like a company at the size of Stripe, that's a project that's more, you know, simple to absorb because you have like a ton of teams that can, parallelize work. But when you are a smaller company, it can be challenging to have this thing to all of a sudden work on, and like half of your engineering team disappears.
How many of you here dedicated a high level of time, good amount of time to comply with GDPR in the past months? Cool.
Yeah.
The others you're just ignoring until it become too big of a thing, right? I think it's
Actually, for people who are interested in GDPR, we love it at Stripe. We love to write some guides, especially for founders, entrepreneurs, or CTOs building companies, and we collect all of those like Atlas guides under the Atlas umbrella, and we actually wrote a guide on GDPR, trying to make sense of it, and write the essence and our recommendations to go through GDPR if you're building a tech startup. So you can take a look at that if you'd like.
I think I remember the day GDPR became official, and it was a blast, a marketing blast, like the whole GDPR bubble exploding. And suddenly, everyone who was the master of GDPR publishing the 101.
Yeah.
So it's
Algolia did also a cool thing where you can, search the official GDPR regulation on the fly with Algolia. That was cool.
That was a very good move. Is there things you do at Stripe you think are really good for the developer experience? Like besides the documentation, the libraries, the design, like is there, I don't know, are you contributing to open source? Have you created some tooling to facilitate the usage?
Yeah, good question. What I really like is the idea of delight. And if there's a way we can delight developers, that's really something that I'm always kind of trying to think about. Whether it's like something surprising in the way you integrate your Stripe API, or something that you did not expect. Like, oh, like that's very smart or clever. And that's something that I love to bring at several touch points when we can. Like these are all small details, but they kind of all matter when you combine them. Like every time you look at the Stripe documentation, for instance, every snippet of code you will see, you can just copy and paste that snippet. It will just work because we replace all the API keys with yours because you're logged in. So at least you'll have to copy and paste a second time to find your key. Or things like at Stripe, we have like test mode and live mode. So the test mode is essentially the exact same, except no payments or founds will move. So you can do everything you want and test everything. But sometimes as a developer, you might make a mistake. You might use the wrong key. So maybe you will just like, try to find or create a charge for a particular customer. That customer won't be found. Will tell you, hey, it looks like you're using your test key, but really, I think you're trying to use your live key instead. So trying to be smart about like, how can we anticipate errors from developers and trying to save them time? Like if you save them like 30 seconds here and 5 minutes there, like that can really add up quickly.
Where do you put that information? Like in the response of the call?
Yeah, so that particular one is the error message of the API call. We'll tell you, hey, I think that object exists, but in live mode to switch your key.
That's cool.
So that's one of them. But yeah, and I think your second part of the question was around like tooling. Yeah, we're trying to do a lot of open source things, and one of the things I'm trying to work on with my coworkers also is to build some very elegant, highly polished, like almost like fake businesses. So if you want to run a SaaS on Stripe, this is really how you should do it. If you want to run a marketplace on Stripe, that might be something like Uber or Lyft, like very on demand with, a great mobile app on one side and a way to onboard your drivers on the other side. That's how you should build it. So we open source all of those demos also. And hopefully that helps developers go faster and, scan some code quickly and, connect the dots and be like, oh yeah, it sounds like exactly what I need for my particular use case.
And are you aiming also to reduce the cost of supporting the API? Because I think it's a big topic for you guys as well.
Yeah, and obviously, like support is critical because even if you do as best as you can on your product and your documentation, there's always gonna be a point where people have questions. They have like a challenge, or maybe you don't support exactly the language they need or something. And so, yeah, like I think having the best support experience really matters. So, like I think was it like a month ago we introduced now 24/7 support at Stripe. That was a big deal because it's actually very very hard to implement, but we really want to make sure that developers and users feel heard when they integrate. So I don't know if many of you still use IRC, but for some reason it's still very popular at Stripe. Like a bunch of developers are asking us questions every day on IRC. So we have some support engineers hanging out there and just like answering questions. And same for Stack Overflow or email. But yeah, I think on the support side, when people ask us like technical questions, we make sure to route that to like engineers at Stripe. So you have really like a technical answer to your problem.
I have a question
Yep.
over here, which is so coming back to the developer experience. So you told us about like having the finest lines on the JavaScript wrapper or whatever. But how do you make sure internally that this philosophy of making sure that developer spend times only on what matter to their business, how do you make sure it gets understood and done by everyone else in the company? It's a big company now, and on a certain stage in terms of human, how do you make sure that this thinking is still going on?
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely challenging as we get bigger and there's more and more products. You want to make sure you guarantee that consistency. But on the API side, it's pretty like now standard at Stripe that every API change will be a written proposal and we'll go through API review and we'll have a team of experts around the table making sure that change, like keeps the cohesive experience. So that's one. And the other thing, like back to kind of the point around like dog fooding and being the customer zero, one thing we're also trying to do as we build things internally using like products from other teams, for instance, we are writing complete like friction logs. So every single time I'm like building something using an API that's about to launch or something, I'm writing like documents about like this was not clear, this was not clear, this is like there's a typo here, or this is not clear, and trying to basically write those friction logs and work with the actual engineering teams to make that better before we launch. So it's challenging to be everywhere, but we're trying to have that culture of really caring so much about the details of the API and doing our best there.
Um, One way to segment your audience is to make a distinction between developers who are building something internal, for example, in an IT department for utilisateurs finaux, and another group that is building Stripe into a component that will then go further down the value chain, a shopping cart plugin like WooCommerce or something like that. So the question is, do you track that distinction? And have you at all begun to start looking at differences in the DevRel process for people who are reselling downstream versus building things that are going to be used by their own team or company?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something that, to be honest, I think Stripe got very lucky to have like very passionate developers very early on building, libraries, for WordPress, for Magento, for many platforms out there that we did not officially support. We got really lucky to have such a vibrant community helping us. But one thing that we've just started to double down on and really invest in was this idea of like, how do we make sense of the ecosystem around us and how can we support them a bit better? Of course, we want to support like Stripe users when they're building their businesses, but we also want to make sure we spend a lot of time with the partners of Stripe, the people who are building for others to use. And so we now have a partner program that we launched about a month ago. And as part of that, we're trying to have a few categories of companies, but you can think of some of them extending the Stripe feature set. So think, for instance, about like Avalara for taxis or Segment for data warehouses, features and so on. So like extending what Stripe does. And also the exact point you made around like people building, plugins for other platforms that we don't officially support as a, primary client or something. So we're just getting started in that journey, but we now have this partner program, and we really want to foster this sense of community and support those developers better when they're building things for others to reuse. And we're also trying to track that a bit better. So for instance, we're working now hand in hand with developers building those plugins so they can actually identify themselves as a plugin author. So in terms of like Stripe, for instance, if we see an email coming in about someone having a particular issue with their account, we'll be able to flag a bit better, oh, they're using this particular WordPress plugin. So obviously it's going to take some time for the community to adjust and surface those data, but we're very excited to work more on that partner program.
Did it force you on the API design to really create new set of endpoints which are more targeted at like bulk operations, or which are simplifying workflows for those guys because they have a way different usage? You mentioned earlier the marketplace, and I think those guys are also doing things in a slightly different way, not the canonical usage of the API as an end user, as Daniel mentioned.
Yeah, I think we're trying to listen to what users need to really kind of take the API always to the next level. And there are things we've done, like the bulk actions. There's a few things that are similar to that in the API, but what you quickly realize for that particular use case is that REST is not an amazing vehicle for bulk actions. And so that's kind of how we ended up building this product called Sigma, which is a way for users to write complete SQL queries against their Stripe dataset. So if you want to export something like, hey, like in the past, let's say you want to have the answer to your question being, in the past year, how many of my credit cards from Visa in this particular country got declined between those dates? That's going to be extremely hard to find from a REST API. And so that's kind of how we ended up solving the question of the data aspect.
And I guess this product is API driven, of course.
Yeah. And again, what's interesting about Stripe, because we think about the APIs always kind of first, it's funny to me because the Stripe dashboard that businesses use every single day, it might be one of the most popular SaaS products out there, but in fact, we never designed it as let's build a SaaS product. It's always been like, no, we've built this API for our users to consume, and it turns out we also leverage our own APIs to build a great dashboard. And it's kind of funny in the development philosophy to flip that.
Yeah, Cedric.
Do you have any ratio of people using directly the API versus people using a library to use Stripe, to integrate with Stripe, for instance? Like you've got a Stripe element, for instance. How many people are using Stripe element versus the REST API directly? Or
yeah, so I think just to explain a little bit more, especially for people who are not familiar with all the products, when you want to integrate payments with Stripe on the web, there's always two components. One being, how do you collect the payment information from the user in the browser or in a mobile app? And then when you've collected and secured that payment information, how do you actually make charges? So when we were talking about the client libraries we support, that's for the backend side of Stripe. It doesn't matter if you're using Ruby, PHP, Go, Java, you can use whatever you'd like on the backend. But for Stripe elements, I think every user of Stripe has to use Stripe.js. Pretty much every user has to use Stripe.js on the browser to actually take the payment information from their customers and tokenize it. And the process of creating a token is essentially this idea that you don't have to worry about PCI compliance anymore because Stripe will take the burden away for you. So when users enter their details in the browser, we send that over to stripe.com and we put all of those things in a secure vault, and we give you, the developer, a token that you can then use online to charge. So to answer your question, I think the vast majority of users on the backend are using one of the official client libraries we have, like the vast majority. Of course, if you're building something using let's say Rust or Haskell on the backend, you're pretty much on your own, or you can use one of the community libraries if you find one. But we cover the vast majority of the needs. And then on the client side, historically we only had Stripe.js, so you had to build your own forms and so on. But once again, it's like a ton of time to build on your own, like, input validation, input formatting, translation, error messages, and all of those things. And so we found that using Stripe elements, people have the best of both worlds. On one hand, they can still customize the look and feel to really match the UI of their app. And at the same time, you don't have to worry about all of those things around like error messages and all the edge cases. So yeah, more and more people are using Stripe elements, but you can think of Stripe elements as one of the components of Stripe.js, essentially.
I think it rings a bell, Cedric. You should talk with Cedric after.
Okay.
That's what was a targeted question.
Okay. I'm curious
Guys,
to learn more now.
I can smell the pizza now. I think we are got in. We are 45, 50 minutes in. Do you have any topics we haven't covered yet? I have still a few would like to cover, but is there any topic? We are lucky to have Romain tonight. Romain is living in San Francisco, so he's not so accessible in Paris. So do you have any topics you would like to chat with him? Yeah, Romain?
So the question is pretty simple. Sourcing feedback from basically end users is pretty easy. How would you say it's different when you need sourcing from devs, if there is any difference?
Yeah, I think what we're trying to do there is trying to catch developers where they are. So if you think about the API documentation, for instance, if people find something that's like inaccurate or think that something that could be more optimal, there's a place for them to give us feedback right there. And also we introduced a ton of new developer tools in the Stripe dashboard where people can monitor their Stripe integrations and see in real time how many requests they're making, the average response times for their webhooks and so on. And right there in the dashboard, people can also type in something to us. And it's actually feedback we read. Like we get like, pinged on Slack with all of those things, and then we structure them and so on. So we're trying to essentially catch developers where they are. So whether they're making an API error or like using the developer tools in the dashboard or using our documentations, those touch points, we try to catch their attention there if they have anything to share with us.
Are you able to infer some feedback? I remember at Mailjet, I loved playing with the raw API logs and just looking at bad usage of the API or wrong usage, and just play with all the data, the API transaction we are giving me to actually get feedback. Are you going that far?
Yeah, and we also, I think, in terms of KPIs for developers and what are we thinking about, I don't think we obsess too much on like the classical, like, let's say marketing metrics and so on. But the kind of metrics we really obsess about are kind of the health of the integrations for users. We want to make sure they have like a very healthy Stripe integration. And we're trying to push them as much like guidance and advice when they're integrating Stripe. So one of the example I really like is when you are, let's say, hitting what looks to be a very malformed URL of the API. Maybe there's a bug in your code base and one of the IDs that should be in the path is actually null or something. We actually surface a warning for you because it might just be one or two errors that we got, but like compound over time, they might matter a lot. So trying to always optimize for the health of the integration of users. And also giving them some warnings if we notice something is an odd behavior that we had not seen before. Sounds like your webhook time is like, going up like significantly. Is everything all right or something?
So, were you able to automate those flow? Like, will I receive an email from Stripe saying something is going wrong?
There's quite a few use cases that we already automated. And for instance, right before we turned off like TLS 1.0 and 1.1, that was one of the warnings we had at the top of the dashboard saying, hey, we are still seeing requests on all versions of TLS. Those are not going to work anymore. And the other cool thing we're trying to make easier, back to your question around like backwards compatibility and version, we're now plotting in real time the number of requests per API version that you're making to Stripe. So if you'd like, you can actually move to new version of the API progressively, because in every API request you're making to us, you can pass a header with your version. So if you only want to spend like, an hour here and maybe 2 hours tomorrow to upgrade yourself, you can do it progressively and you can see live your progression on the dashboard. So those are the things that we're trying to build for developers to be more efficient as much as possible.
Cool. Any topic, guys? Yeah.
How do you manage documentation? Who's writing and updating documentation? And how do you keep it consistent?
Yeah, very, very good question. So the same way as a lot of people at Stripe care about developers, pretty much all of the employees, I think kind of the same for documentation. So we do have, for instance, developer relations, technical writers, also kind of looking at docs and constantly working on them. But the reality is like many teams contribute to docs. So for instance, when you have a brand new set of endpoints or maybe a brand new product, most likely the engineers will put together some early versions of docs and they will collaborate with docs to, get to the first version, and then the technical writers will help with the style and tone and so on. That's for like the long style guides. The long developer guides. But for the API reference itself, like the kind of single page, 3-column layout um, uh, documentation we have, that's mostly automated. So we make sure we are never out of sync between the code and this API reference, because we document the API endpoints right where we write the code. So we can't really be out of sync on that API reference. But one thing we're also exploring and investing in more and more is the Open API stuff that I mentioned earlier. So we now publish an Open API spec for Stripe, both Open API v2 and v3. So it's open source on GitHub, and we push that spec multiple times a week, I think. And the advantage of that is also to let developers use the tools they prefer. So if you love, for instance, tinkering with like pow.cloud or Postman, you can now just import once the URL of the Stripe API where the spec lives, and then now you can just like use that as your documentation that's like on your desktop if you'd like. But yeah, a lot of people working on docs at Stripe, and including non-technical people. The first, one of the mistakes I think that people do sometimes at some companies is to have a very, very large internal knowledge base, but a lot of that gold mine being like inaccessible from the outside. So what we're trying to do is when people email us questions about their Stripe account or their Stripe business, we're trying to first find if that answer exists somewhere publicly on the docs. And if it does, it's great. If it doesn't, we should probably publish it. And so trying to always have more and more people, even non-technical people, contributing to docs, and have more and more of that gold mine outside of the organization.
Hey, so about a month ago, Stripe goes out of a pure API world and just put a foot on real world with cards.
Mm-hmm.
So what was the idea behind it? Because do you want people to build banks like Quanto or Shine or whatever? What is the aim beyond that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for context, for people who might not have heard of it, we launched a new product about a month ago. It's currently in private beta, and it's called Stripe Issuing. So for the first time, you can think of the Stripe platform entering the physical world, because using an API endpoint, if you do like a post request, you can actually create a virtual or physical credit card. And it's pretty fascinating, by the way, to just issue a post request and get a piece of plastic in the mail after that. And the idea there is to let, once again, like developers leverage one more piece of infrastructure that was previously missing. So there's a ton of use cases, and I'm sure we have not thought about all of them. And that's the beauty of building APIs and infrastructure. You always get surprised by what people will build. But there's a ton of use cases that we already anticipate and people have requested from us. So for instance, it might be a simple use case like a Stripe business willing to give some corporate cards to their employees. It's like a very simple use case. But I think it's going to be extremely interesting in the context of Stripe Connect marketplaces, because sometimes in a marketplace, there's like multiple parties. And obviously you want to route and move money between multiple of those parties. But imagine for a second, let's say a food delivery service, a la Deliveroo, for instance, and you want that delivery service to have a delivery person going to the restaurant, paying for the food, and then delivering the food. Well, maybe now they could use like a Stripe issued card when they show up at the restaurant and use that to pay for the food. But the beauty of the Stripe issuing product to me is that unlike all of the other products that are pretty awesome on the market, like Monzo or like, Revolut, all of those are like, very consumer facing products. The beauty of Stripe issuing is that it's a very developer facing product again, which means that you can not only create those cards using an API call, you can also specify on the fly with some code what kind of transactions you want to allow or not. So for instance, you could say, I'm going to create a card that only works in restaurants in this particular geography and for those particular amounts. And maybe you can even combine those criteria with some criteria of your own. And like, is the user currently active in my platform or something? So once again, as every other Stripe feature, as soon as someone tries to use the card, whether it's online or at a point of sale, maybe in a restaurant, we'll send you a webhook event with all the details about what's happening. And you can handle that webhook event. You have 2 seconds to respond to us because someone's waiting. And then you can say, yep, I'm going to approve that transaction because it looks like a restaurant and not like Amazon.com, for instance. And you say, yep, everything seems valid. Let's approve the transaction or decline it. So yeah, very exciting about issuing because once again, it's the developer lens on a very popular problem. And I'm sure we'll be amazed by what people want to build with it.
Does it answer your question? Cool. And do you see Stripe issuing like as an infrastructure? So the end goal being to help business foster faster, or the big plan is to have like higher level product on top of issuing?
We'll see. For now, I think we're just getting started on this product, and I think there's also, I didn't mention it, but there's also a lot of interesting use cases in the virtual space. Also, without the piece of plastic, those virtual cards, they will work with Apple Pay and all of those things. So all of those pieces combined, there's a lot of cool things people could do. And there are also some, the virtual cards, they're also an interesting use case because when you understand how some like booking sites work at times, they actually use your card, but they want to have a different card number that they expose to like another, party. So you could imagine like creating a virtual card number for that particular thing and exposing the other one and so on. So yeah, for now, it's like we're building the infrastructure for the virtual and the physical cards. And there's a lot to build on just that. And we'll see if there's anything we can build on top at some point. But we always try to think API first, and we'll see where we can build later. And I think it connects to what we discussed earlier with like this developer coefficient and how developers spend their time. One part of the answer is making sure developers are productive, efficient, and working on the right things, not maintaining bad code or something. But the other part that we have not discussed is also making sure that your developers work on like very high leverage things. It happens quite frequently that in a company that, someone from sales and someone from partnerships is like, let's summon a developer to get the answer to that question. And that's also why we're building more and more features inside the Stripe dashboard so that, pretty much every employee at a company can be able to not only like, let's say, create sellers, refund charges and all of those things without asking an engineer to do an API call. So I'm sure in the future we'll add more to the Stripe dashboard for that product also.
I remember we met a few months ago and you told me like that was a driver for you, like building more and more developer tools in Stripe. So you understand that some tasks are not API driven or are not performed by developers.
Yeah.
And so it's an important focus for the product as well.
Yeah. And sometimes people ask me the difference between like Stripe and other payment providers, or they ask me like, how do we fit in the ecosystem? And I think the best way that I found to explain it is when you compare Stripe not to a PSP or a payment gateway, but rather comparing Stripe to like AWS or GCP. When they started AWS, they only had kind of S3, EC2, and maybe a couple other services. And same for Google Cloud, they started with compute and storage. But then you realize over time that like compute and storage alone don't get you very far because you probably want to have like authentication and caching and databases and all of those services on top. And now like each of those two, and Azure also, they have like hundreds of services. So I think you can think of Stripe as like, okay, like it's almost like the core payment is our, kind of compute and storage thing, but there's like so much more to add on top of that platform. And yeah.
Do you think Stripe at some point is going to become like the provider for the next Revolut, Monzo, or N26?
That's a good question. I don't know. Stripe actually invested in Monzo, I think earlier this year. But yeah, that's a good question. We'll see like which part of the infrastructure they could use. But yeah, we're always trying to think about infrastructure and developer APIs first, and trying to optimize for that. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure which feature you're referring to. Like in the case of Monzo, they're a bank. So yeah, there's a few different things in there. But I think if you're referring, for instance, to like the creation of a card, then like that's something that's definitely possible. Yeah. Yeah. And I think even back to that spectrum of like infrastructure with like the core payments and like services and applications on top, that core payments is something we constantly have to work on and make evolve. Because like we were talking the last time about how kind of easy it was for me at Twitter to think about like, oh yeah, we can actually translate Twitter in every language and all of a sudden it works everywhere. But something like Stripe is much harder because you have to make sure you have the right payment methods, you have the right currencies, you have the right, compliance rules and so on in every country you want to expand to. So that's why we're focusing so much on the infrastructure, because we know that that helps unlock new markets for our users. And we've seen users like Kickstarter, for instance, they follow Stripe every time we launch to a new country. They also follow that, and they launched Kickstarter to that new country because now all of a sudden we unlock new markets for them. And same here with other great companies like Blade, for instance, who were able to really go super fast in many countries by just leveraging Stripe.
Yeah, Romain, thank you. Actually, you maybe already answered the question, but do you have, so at the beginning of the talk, you talked a little bit about how exotic, even in Europe, the payment methods can be. Then do you have a structured approach to promote these different payment methods, actually, or do you only expose the API and hope that the documentation is very, very good as much as you can do, and that you let the developers only on their own?
Yeah, so when you say promote, you mean promote to the end customer, or you mean to promote to our developers and businesses?
Yeah, to promote to the businesses, the different payment methods you expose.
Yeah, I think that's something we could do a lot more into. Like, I think we published, for instance, a payment methods guide at Stripe that tries to be kind of the full-on reference, not about Stripe, but rather, hey, here is the state of the market as we know it, and this is what we recommend per country and so on. And we also worked a lot on what we called like the sources API, kind of trying to find this like API abstraction that could lead to integrating every payment method really quickly. No matter where you want to expand, no matter which payment method you want to support, we have this like sources that abstracts away all of those weird complexities for payment methods. But even then, you make a right point. It's like, how do you make sure that in every country, developers are doing the work to actually put the payment methods that are relevant for each of those. So I think we're still early there, but what we found is that developers need more help, and they want to have more support from Stripe to actually not think about that problem, but have more of that built in.
Okay, so this first step is then you evangelize as well on each, so to say, country, different payment methods the marketplaces or the developer can use.
Yeah, we so in the past year and a half or so, we worked on this like sources platform that was kind of already a first step, because like instead of embracing the complexity of every payment method and exposing that complexity to every user and giving them like different docs and different APIs for each of them, we took the first stab at like, okay, we can build for the first time an abstraction of all of those things. Now that's done, I think what we found is that we need to take a bit more of the burden one more time and actually help developers just expose the right methods per country and so on. And so that's something we're currently like thinking a ton about. Like, how can we make sure that people use 3D Secure where it makes sense? How can we make sure they expose like Sofort and GiroPay in Germany in the right order and so on? That's like still a ton of UI work. We'd love to help developers a bit more. So we started by expanding elements too. Now you have elements for SEPA, you have elements for the bank selection of ideal and so on. So less and less UI work for you to do. So we're constantly iterating there, but we'd love to get to the point where you have almost nothing to do for that use case.
Okay, thank you. Cool, thanks, Shubham. I think we're about to close. We already asked a lot to Romain. It's been more than an hour we're talking now, and I think Romain can stay a bit.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to stick around if you have any more questions. So
cool. So I think we can first give a big round of applause to Romain. A few closing words. Is there anyone, any company inspiring you on the API scene these days?
Quite a lot. I think Algolia is doing very well. I think I'm a big fan of the product and still amazed by how fast it is. So I really love Algolia. And then there's a few smaller companies that I think really invest a ton in developer experience. And one of them that comes to mind is Zeit. I don't know if some of you know Zeit, zeit.co. That team is building some very cool features to help you like deploy simple apps to the cloud very quickly. So yeah, I think these are the two that come to mind. But there's a ton of good stuff happening in the API space. But it's great to see more and more actors also from Paris. So
yeah, that's a good follow-up question. Like you are now you live a few years in France, in Paris. Now you live in San Francisco. How do you see the two scenes compete? And you were mentioning earlier that you're happy to see Paris rising. What are the key differences you can notice?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is when I was building Jolly Cloud, 10 years ago, there were only like a handful of startups in Paris. And now it's pretty awesome to be back and see like all these vibrant ecosystem, like Paris API meetups and so on. And more companies being started and having like global ambitions from day one. I think that has also struck me. I think back in the days, I think it was really hard to not only start a business, but also even think about growing it. I think it's kind of nice to see French entrepreneurs also having those like big ambitions from the start. So I think SF is still like a great place for Silicon Valley, where like there's this huge culture and, mix of people kind of working on hard challenges and willing to really help each other. But it's really nice to see the European ecosystem having pretty much like all the cards in hand now to do great things. So that's exciting.
Cool. Thanks a lot, everyone, for attending. I hope you learned a few things about Stripe. I hope it helped. It was super cool to have Romain, first person abroad, coming from abroad, even if he's French, but cheating a bit. Hopefully that's one of many. It was a challenge for him as well. He was alone. Previous chats were 3 people, so it was more bandwidth I was asking to Romain tonight. So I hope you enjoyed it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the conversation. Thanks to everybody for attending and for the questions. And back to the point we were just making about Paris and Europe, I think one thing I should say is that Stripe is investing a ton in the Paris tech scene. So the team here is moving to a new office next month. And we're hoping to foster more the community, maybe host some of those meetups in the future. And more broadly in Europe, we're also investing. We're officially building an engineering office in Dublin. And the approach there is really unique. We don't want to have, distributed engineering offices, having like support functions only. We really want to have engineers who are building the core product of Stripe, leveraging their knowledge of the market, in Europe, leveraging their skill set and really having great talent building the core product. So if you're interested, if you know some friends would love to work on that, definitely let me know. And we're more than excited to invest in the Paris tech scene and the European tech scene.
Cool. So we'll come discover the Stripe offices in a few months.
Yeah, I think they're moving like somewhat late October. So
cool.
Yeah.
As I was saying, so the next meetup will be handled by Shubham. It will be about API in GraphQL. So we'll dive deep into, I think, a subject which has risen went down. So, but I think there are still a few learnings. We'll try to gather a panel of people who've succeeded to go in GraphQL because they started from day one, people who decided not to do that move from REST, and hopefully someone who tried and failed. So we'll have a good mix of, we don't want to give you a super positive approach, like GraphQL is solving all of my issues, like it's not what we're aiming for. So it should be an interesting talk as well. So we'll happen on the 9th and at WeWork Lafayette. So, but anyway, we will announce as usual. So it's time for beer and pizza, I think. So enjoy the rest of the night and hopefully see you next month.
Thank you, Arnaud, and thank you, everybody.
Let's do a quick group photo.